Hello, it's time to learn how to make a sourdough bread. I'm Ben Eagle from Adult Services here at Carnegie-Stout Public Library. And actually today we're not learning how to make the bread. This video is going to be broken into two parts. Because sourdough, you need a starter first. And that video is today's lesson, how to make a starter for sourdough. The second part will be how to make the actual bread. So today, we're just going to show you how to make the starter, get that cultivated so you're ready to make the bread in a couple weeks. So, I want to say first that by no means am I an expert at this. I want to keep this video very basic so that you could do it with as few supplies as possible, the same way I started out doing it. And I want to stress that you want to have a spirit of experimentation while you're doing this, because there's a lot of waiting involved. The concepts are basic, but yes, there's a lot of waiting involved, and it's just fun to watch science in action with the little bubbles forming in your starter and learning how to make bread the old-fashioned way. That being said, let me get you started with the starter. The starter is made simply by mixing flour and water. You mix flour and water, and that's it. You leave it out, and then you keep feeding it. Okay. So what happens when you mix flour and water? Well, when you add water to flour, it stimulates the microbes that are already in there, the wild yeasts and bacteria that are everywhere, particularly on the flour, maybe in your hands and in the environment. So no two sourdoughs are exactly the same. All the starters are created from whatever wild yeast and bacteria are in your environment. So when you add water to it, it stimulates them. And what they do, those yeasts and bacteria feed on the natural sugars that are in the flour once you add water to it. And when they feed on the flour, the sugars in the flour, they release carbon dioxide, little air pockets in the flour. And when you keep feeding that, adding more flour each day and more water, it stimulates them to keep reproducing and making more and more of them. And when that happens, or when you do it enough times and you get a big enough colony, soon you have enough there to raise a loaf of bread when you mix it with other flour and put it in the oven. That is the most basic thing of what's going on. So the yeast, bacteria feed on the sugars that are already in the flour and release carbon dioxide to ferment the flour, turn it into a sourdough starter. Before we get started mixing everything together, I want to go over what supplies you're going to need. Basically, to mix it together, you're going to need a flour, a water, and then some kind of container to keep it in. Now, let me go over the specifics of each of those. I have a lot of flours laid out. You can pretty much use any kind of flour from what I've read. I haven't made that many starters, so I can't tell you from experience how each will work. They all behave a little bit differently though. I will say, early on when I started, I had the best luck with whole wheat. Just a straight whole wheat flour. That's what I used for my first one, and I still continue to use that starter. And I've had good luck with the one I'm using now, which is a 50-50 blend of whole wheat and bread flour. Early on, I didn't have as much luck with all-purpose, but everything I've been reading says that all-purpose works well to do a starter. Now maybe the one I had was bleached. I think you want to look for unbleached. The bleaching process might be bad for some of that. those microbes that are going to transform the flour into a starter. So if you're doing an all-purpose, maybe try a better brand, or getting an unbleached one. Because when I did it the first time, it didn't develop bubbles, and then it developed a mold after a few days, and then I had to toss it. That being said, if it doesn't develop bubbles right away, you can leave it out to see if it does. But if you're not seeing bubbles within a couple days, it's probably not going to do anything. Everything I've done here, I've been seeing bubbles right away. So you can pretty much use any kind of flour. Go ahead and try it, experiment with it. But if you're starting out your first one, I would try some kind of bread flour, whether it's all-purpose or just unbleached bread flour, or if you want a little healthier loaf, mixing whole wheat in with bread flour seems to work great. Or if you're going gluten-free, you can do some kind of rice flour. I haven't tried that at all, and I can't tell you the specifics about that, but there are options to make gluten-free sourdough as well. Now, the water. You don't want to use just regular tap water. Well, you can try it, but likely there's going to be too much chlorine in there, which is going to kill all of the microbes that you want to get the starter going. So I use spring water. It has the minerals in there that really help get the starter going. So for me, I've had the best luck with spring water. So you should be all set if you get spring water, any of these kind of flours, and you'll need a small container. Now I like a clear container so I can see what's going on in there. It can be glass or plastic, but clear is good so you can kind of study what's going on and get used to that. And then you'll want either a lid or something to cover it with, which I'll go over when I mix it up. Okay, now to create the starter. So first off, I go in with the spring water. I pour the spring water about halfway to fill the container. You could really either go with the water or the flour first, but this kind of gives me a better measurement so it doesn't overflow once it goes. And I use spring water, not tap water. I haven't tried tap water, but I don't imagine it would have very good results. And now here I'm mixing in the flour. I've chose all-purpose for this one. You can try mixing it with any kind of flour, really. So I'm stirring that in. I want to get a batter-like consistency, almost like a pancake batter. You don't want it too runny, and you don't want it too thick. So I'm stirring it to make sure there's no lumps. I'm mixing all the flour in real well. And if it's a little thick or a little runny, it's no big deal. That just makes the speed of fermenting different. So if it's a real runny batter, it'll ferment faster. If it's real thick, it'll ferment slower. So I'm just going to keep mixing that in. And I'm stirring it with a chopstick. You could do it with your fingers or a spoon. I just find a chopstick works real well, and it's easier to clean. It doesn't stick as much as it does to a spoon. And I can scrape the sides of the bowl as I stir with the chopstick. Just to clean up a little bit, I like to go at the sides with this little spatula. I find this works really well. Otherwise, just wipe it with a towel or a paper towel, just to keep it clean so it doesn't get real crusty as it goes. Alright, wiping the sides down. And then I put a loose fitting lid on. You don't want it too tight because you want some air to be able to get in. So you can use just a loose fitting lid. If you have a mason jar, you can put on the lid and not screw it all the way, or you can put on a coffee filter or some other kind of towel, just a kitchen towel and maybe a rubber band. Just having a lid on it's going to prevent any bugs from getting in or any dust or other debris. So there, it's ready to sit now. So I won't be feeding that until tomorrow. So one thing I'll keep an eye on, which is fun, I'll be checking on it periodically and I'll be seeing bubbles form in there. And like I said, you can already see those yeast and bacteria going to work and creating that carbon dioxide. Glorious bubbles. Okay, so put a lid on that and we'll come back to it. Put it somewhere out of the way in your kitchen and leave it alone. And then you'll want to feed it. So that is the next step. You'll wait to do that until the next day. Okay, so this is going to be the first feeding. You'll notice I got an empty dish here. This is to put the excess stuff in, and I am just going to throw away the excess, or well, I compost it. You can throw it away or compost it. Please don't put it in a sink. It's not a good idea to wash wet flour down a sink. It's almost like a glue. You know, it can clog your pipes eventually. So throw it away or compost it. Or better yet, once your starter gets going, you can use that. I've made just simple flatbreads with some of the excess stuff. Just pour some of it in the pan or add some more flour to it, and you can make a nice little flatbread with it. But to feed it, you're gonna get rid of most of it. So I've got a big spoon here. I'm gonna mix up what I have here. And I'm gonna discard most of it. I'll leave like maybe a tablespoon in there or so. Yeah, that looks maybe even a little bit more. Just a little bit on the bottom of my dish. That's enough to get this next batch going nicely. Okay, now that I've emptied about 80% of my starter, I'm gonna feed it. So I put in equal parts flour and water. So I'm doing 4 tablespoons of each with the flour and spring water. You may find that worked well for my container. You may find a little more, a little less works fine for you, and that's fine, but 4 is around that is a good amount. And I did the same process here as when I started the starter. I put the lid on and then I let it sit again. So that was the process of feeding the starter. So basically you'll be doing that every day around the same time. If it's not exactly at the same time each day, that's okay. The starter's pretty resilient. Even if you miss a whole day, they want to thrive. So they're gonna, as long as you feed it again, it'll get going again. But to really get those bubbles drawing and ready to bake the bread, you want to try to get it at a regular feeding where it'll rise and fall around the same time each day. Generally that takes about 10 days or so, depending on the temperature and how much bubbles you're getting. Just keep it going until it rises and falls at the same time, pretty much every day. And then eventually you'll find out that it'll almost seem like it wants to be fed a second time. Like if you fed it in the morning, it seems like it would be ready at night. I'd feed it maybe one more time and then pop it in the fridge. The fridge isn't going to kill it. It just slows the fermentation down, so you don't have to feed it every day. So if you're baking a bread once a week, I put it in the fridge and feed it once a week at the same time I'm making bread. But once your starter is ready to go, you can make the bread first and then put the rest of the starter in the fridge. Here's a few pictures that I've taken of my last starter that I made. This first one, that's about what it looked like after I made the starter. So that was the first day. You see it developed a dark sort of liquid on top. I noticed with this new starter, the liquid was more clear. That could be because it was all-purpose flour. I'm not sure. This is more of a grainier flour. This was my half blend, half whole wheat and half bread flour. So that's day 1. And then here's a top view. You can see that there's some bubbles in there. not a whole lot. So that's before I fed it. And then I'm gonna skip to another day. All right, you can see the liquid's kind of moved to the bottom now, and it's pushed everything up. And let's get a top view, and you can see all the bubbles on there. So that's a pretty active starter there. And then I'll show you several days later. I won't show each day because it kind of looks similar most days, but you can see once it got very active, it went over the container I had. I think I was doing 5 tablespoons of flour and 5 tablespoons of water when I was feeding it, and that's when I found out I could get away with 4. You know, measurements aren't exact. If you just fill it about halfway each time and then watch, you can feed it a little more or a little less depending on the size of your container. And you can see, yeah, it overflowed there. I had trouble getting the lid off because it got kind of crusty. I then switched it to another clean container, just so I wouldn't have all that crusty stuff on there. But then after about 10 days, it was ready to go. And the next video, you will see how to make bread. So I hope you enjoyed this video. So we learned what a sourdough starter is. We learned how to create one by just adding any kind of flour with spring water and mixing it together. And then we learned how to feed it, which is just gonna increase those bubbles. And then the next step is gonna be how to make bread. So once those bubbles are all over the place, once the bacteria and yeast are very active in your starter, you'll have enough in there to raise a loaf of bread, and that will be the next video. So I hope you stay tuned for that, and thank you for watching. Bye.